concluded. Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Senator Rennick says he's extracted a change in government policy from the Prime Minister in exchange for his vote on Senate procedural motions. Why has the Prime Minister allowed himself to become hostage to a senator who boasts he's unvaccinated and proudly spreads vaccine disinformation? And what other changes to government policy is the Prime Minister willing to negotiate with Senator Rennick?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government has been considering for some weeks now improvements to the compensation scheme in relation to people who have had adverse reactions to the vaccine, Mr Speaker, and we have decided to ensure that that threshold is $1,000, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, I don't know why those opposite would think that was a bad idea, where we have been running a national vaccine program, Mr Speaker, that now has one of the highest rates of vaccination in the world. But, Mr Speaker, we also know that in any national vaccine program there are adverse reactions to vaccines, and we put in place an indemnity scheme to provide confidence to the Australian people so they could go forward and they could get these vaccines, Mr Speaker, and that is one of the many reasons why, under the national vaccine program, we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Now, Mr Speaker, if those opposite don't think we should have an indemnity scheme for people who have adverse reactions to the vaccine, if they think that is some sort of a pandering, Mr Speaker, to an anti-vax movement, I disagree with them. We put this in place, Mr Speaker, to ensure there was a proper indemnity scheme to give confidence in the national vaccine program. So what are those opposite doing? When we put it in place and we make sure it's fair and more equitable, with the same tight restrictions about the proof of injury, Mr Speaker, and harm, what do? They want to play politics with it, like they have, Mr Speaker, all the way through the pandemic. I'm so pleased we didn't have to rely on the opposition during the pandemic, Mr Speaker, because we wouldn't have got the results.
Order. Has the Prime Minister completed his question? The member for Ryan has.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Australia is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and confidence is building, but significant challenges lie ahead of us. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is demonstrating strong and decisive leadership to keep Australians safe by addressing the many threats to our national security so we can look to better days ahead?
In his community. I'm pleased to see him here back in the House, Mr Speaker, to him and his family. Mr Speaker, Australians have proved during our response to the COVID-19 pandemic their strength. They have proved their strength, and indeed our response has had faith in that strength, Mr Speaker, and the resilience of Australians, and that has resulted in Australia having one of the lowest fatality rates of COVID-19 of almost any country in the world, saving more than 30,000 lives here, at least, Mr Speaker, in Australia because of our response to COVID. Mr Speaker, in addition, we've had one of the strongest economies of advanced nations around the world pushing through COVID with great strength from the Australian people, particularly small business owners, Mr Speaker. And we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Australians, more importantly, Mr Speaker, have shown their strength during this pandemic to this great threat of the pandemic. But this is not the only threat that Australia has had to continue to face, not just during the course of this pandemic, but over many years, and we will continue to in the future, Mr Speaker. And that's why our government has continued to take strong and effective action, Mr Speaker, to counter the threats that Australia faces. Importantly, $1.2 billion, Mr Speaker. $1.2 billion to protect women and children from violence in the most recent budget, Mr Speaker, including the announcement today by the Minister for a Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner, supported by funding, Mr Speaker, $300 million to implement our National Suicide Prevention Plan, Mr Speaker, as part of a $2.3 billion program to support mental health in this country. And I pay particular credit not only to the ministers, Mr Speaker, but Christine Morgan, who's done an outstanding job on that program. Mr Speaker, taking on the social media giants, which I know the member for Ryan has a passionate interest in, as does the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, to ensure that that social media space can be a safe space for children and they can be protected in that place, and it cannot be used as a weapon by terrorists, which we took all the way to the G20, Mr Speaker. Combating terrorism and violent extremism and increasing the powers and resources, Mr Speaker, to our agencies to achieve that. And today we have listed fully Hezbollah, Mr Speaker, but not as a terrorist organisation. But not only them, we have listed the base, a violent right-wing extremist organisation, Mr Speaker. We have no truck with that sort of business, Mr Speaker. I can assure you, and no one in this House should. Smashing organised crime through programs like Operation Ironside and record investments in defence, AUKUS, working with our partners. Mr Speaker, Australia cannot afford weakness on national security. It cannot afford weakness on a national security to keep Australians safe.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, when will the Prime Minister show leadership and rein in Senator Rennick, who is undermining the vaccination effort, spreading conspiracy theories and holding Australia back from being able to be opened up by undermining that very vaccination process? When will he stop pandering to Senator Rennick, offering him concessions, and instead show leadership?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, when I think about the next election, and I think, Mr Speaker, I've only been going for 3 seconds. 3 seconds!
Prime Minister has the call.
3 seconds. They're very touchy today, Mr Speaker. There he is, getting all upset and tetchy. Calm down. Mr Speaker, one of the people in this place who I have relied on heavily is the member for Higgins, Mr Speaker. I've relied on the member for Higgins and her counsel and support and her experience that has guided I and the Minister for Health, Mr Speaker. And I know who's opposing her at the next election, someone who spoke against the AstraZeneca vaccine from the Labor Party, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left and my right. Members on my right. Before I call upon the Manager of Opposition Business, I will issue warnings before I toss someone under 94A. The Leader of the Opposition, for today anyway, the Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
On direct relevance, the Prime Minister is not even trying to be directly relevant to this question. It's the same game the Deputy Prime Minister played yesterday.
No, the Prime Minister is being relevant insofar. The Prime Minister is directly relevant in addressing the issue of the vaccinations. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, and this government has absolutely no truck at all, Mr Speaker, with those who would speak against the importance of getting vaccines in this country. That is not my government's policy. That is not our government's policy, Mr Speaker. And I would urge all Australians to continue to go and get that vaccine. And I have such faith in Australians to do that, Mr Speaker, that I don't think they have to be paid off like the Leader of the Opposition thought they had to be, Mr Speaker. I had great faith that they knew what they had to do to protect themselves and their families and their communities. The Labor Party had so little faith in the people of Australia that he thought they had to pay them off, Mr Speaker, to do the right thing by public health in this country. I let that reflect on the views that the Leader of the Opposition has about the strength and character of the Australian people. I have a better opinion of the people of Australia, Mr Speaker, and what they're doing.
The Prime Minister will return to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I will. So, Mr Speaker, I encourage all Australians to go and get the vaccination. It is actually this government who's secured those vaccines, who's got them into the arms, Mr Speaker, supported the national vaccination program, which has seen us rise to one of the highest levels of vaccination in the world, Mr Speaker, and that is something I think Australians can all be proud of. I had my booster shot the other day, Mr Speaker, with Jane Malishak, and I was pleased to be with her again, and I was pleased to hear from Jane that every time that she went to get her first injection, where I went with her and her second, Mr Speaker, that was also in particular encouraging old Australians, including in the very aged care facility which she lived, to go and get that. And now we are sitting at over 99%, I think, of first-dose vaccinations, and even almost close on that on second-dose vaccinations for Australians aged over 70. Now, Mr Speaker, I put my arm where the vaccines need to go, Mr Speaker, and our government's put its shoulder to the wheel when it comes to the vaccination program, and that's why, Mr Speaker, we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. I'm disappointed that there were those, Mr Speaker, around the country who talked down the AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm disappointed they did, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's time has expired. Order. Order. The member for O'Connor has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is delivering significant national and regional infrastructure which supports regional communities and economies, particularly in my home state of Western Australia? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternatives?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note his absolute diligence to the great state of Western Australia and his work in certain areas, especially in his attention to the agricultural industry and his personal involvement in the great exports of that state, especially in the grain industry, and also his continued support of live sheep exports, where I think is so vitally important that we earn export dollars from them. So it's an area where he manages to stand up for his state when so many others are trying to let it down, especially in the live sheep exports. But, Mr Speaker, the honourable member asks questions in regards to the infrastructure spend that this side of the House, that this government is spending in Western Australia. Since 2013, we've committed over $17.3 billion towards infrastructure projects in Western Australia. And this has been far and wide, from both urban Perth right out to the Tanami Road, going up to Halls Creek, an incredibly important investment project for the Indigenous people of that part of the world, to allow them to get, especially from Alice Springs up towards Halls Creek along the Tanami Desert. It's also in projects such as the Outback Way, which is also so vitally important in opening up the gold precincts around Laverton. Mr Speaker, even in the seat of O'Connor, such projects as the Western Australia agricultural supply chain improvements, vitally important. The freight vehicle productivity improvements, vitally important. The Albany Highway from Kelmscott to Williams, the pavement rehabilitation, Albany Ring Road, the Great Eastern Highway, and these are all parts of the projects that are so vitally important in making sure that we stand with Western Australians in allowing them to earn the export dollars, which is so vitally important for our nation. Mr Speaker, regional Australia is doing its part, and it was very, very, very sad yesterday when the member for Ballarat, the first question she wants to ask on regional infrastructure is this slurring, snide approach that regional Australia would be represented on Infrastructure Australia. In fact, don't ever have a chair from regional Australia. She asked the question yesterday, Mr Speaker, is it true? Well, of course she knew it was true, because Mr Murray had contacted Mr Albanese. But of course, very sneakily, they pretended that call hadn't been made. very sneakily they disclosed most likely a private call into a public forum. And of course she knew the answer. It's very sneaky when you know the answer to a question and ask if it's true. But we know that unless you're inside of Ultimo for the Labor Party, you ultimately don't matter.
Deputy Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister falsely claim a News Corp journalist had a harassment claim filed against them when it wasn't true? Why does the Prime Minister always accuse first and make excuses later?
The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, the first point is that the second half of that question was clearly out of order. It's a reflection on the Prime Minister. It's not a factual statement. It's not anything other than a slur, and it should be ruled out of order.
I'm happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Yeah, thanks. To the point of order, which it's an unusual one. Questions of this form have been asked for some time, and effectively what is being put by the Leader of the House is that it's not open to us to test the credibility of the Prime Minister.
I'm going to allow the question. Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for the question. I addressed those issues some time ago, including with those, Mr Speaker, who were directly impacted by those remarks. And, Mr Speaker, I was relying on some reports which proved not to be correct, Mr Speaker, and I took the appropriate action by contacting those who were directly affected and remedying that matter directly with them. That's what one should do in those circumstances, and that's exactly what I did, Mr Speaker.
Member for Gorton. The member for Indo has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and congratulations to you.
Thank you.
My question is to the Prime Minister. With only 5 sitting days left this year, there is no government bill for Integrity Commission in sight. If you truly want to pass a bill, you write one, you table it, you bring it on for debate. That's what I've done, but you've shut down debate on my bill in the House, you've shut down debate in the Senate, and you've muzzled the Attorney-General, who is missing in action on this. Come clean with the Australian people. Prime Minister, do you honestly expect Australians to believe you truly want a robust Integrity Commission?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'll ask the Minister representing the Attorney-General to add to my answer. Now, Mr Speaker, the exposure draft legislation on these matters will again be made available very soon, Mr Speaker, and the government's priority, as we've been coming out of COVID, has been returned to a number of high priority areas.
Just resume your seat for one moment. It's really not helpful to anybody when the level of interjections are so high that I can't hear the Prime Minister, and I would ask the Prime Minister if he could speak up a little bit. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Maybe I address my comments this way. The sound will travel a little better. Now, Mr Speaker, the government has been returning to some priority legislation after having spent the last 2 years focused on the pandemic response and the economic recovery, Mr Speaker. And the first of those priorities has been to ensure that we finalise the Religious Discrimination Act, which I look forward to introducing into this House tomorrow, Mr Speaker. At the same time, the Attorney-General has been working steadily away and been working with Cabinet on our draft legislation for an Integrity Commission, Mr Speaker, and that also soon will be available for people to give their responses to, Mr Speaker, and we'll see whether that has support. The bills and other proposals that have been put forward are not proposals that are supported by the government. What we have been doing already has been taking action to invest in organisations like ACLI, Mr Speaker, and in extending their coverage to be the Australian the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. One of the members opposite didn't seem to be aware of what that was. Mr Speaker, we have invested in that organisation to ensure that it's reaching more and more of the government agencies. It's an important integrity office of the Commonwealth. It's very different to what happens at state levels. To make an assumption that the enforcement regimes and the authorities that exist already at a Commonwealth level are different to those, are the same as those at a state level is different, and that's why you often see different things done at a Commonwealth and a state level. But I would ask the Minister representing the Attorney-General to add further.
The Minister representing the Attorney-General has the call.
Well, I do thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to add to his comments in response to the member's question about the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. We've been through a nationwide consultation process, Mr Speaker. Some 330 written submissions received, some 46 consultations, meetings and roundtables. And very importantly, Mr Speaker, we've committed substantial funding. In fact, almost $150 million of funding has been committed for this body, and at full capacity the Commonwealth Integrity Commission will have around 172 staff. As the Prime Minister has made clear, the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity will be subsumed, it's envisaged, within the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. And so, of course, we've also set out models of explanation of the powers that this will have, and we continue to work on this very important body.
Order. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Morrison government's proven record of cutting taxes and providing investment incentives helping to safeguard our economy's rebound from the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and acknowledge that she's a champion for Western Sydney and for manufacturing in her area. And there are more than 14,000 businesses in her electorate that are benefiting and able to be eligible for the expanded instant asset write-off, like Darmel Air Conditioning, which used that tax incentive to go and purchase a new ute and new tools. Now, Mr Speaker, last year we were facing economic Armageddon. There were some forecasts that unemployment could reach as high as 15%. Today, unemployment is actually lower than when we came to government, and we have seen small business tax rates come down to their lowest level in 50 years. And in the last 3 months, we saw tax relief of more than $10 billion to 11 million Australians. That is the product, that is the dividend of having a strong economy. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative policies? Now, Mr Speaker, we've talked about some of the big ideas from the Leader of the Opposition in this place before. Some big ideas.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. On the point of order, the Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, in terms of the standing orders that require ministers to be answering about their portfolios, are we in a situation now where they only have to give 1 minute on their portfolio and 2/3 of the question is then a sledge against the other side?
Is your point of order in relation to relevance?
No. The point of order is in terms. There's previous rulings that have been made by previous speakers about preambles.
The Manager of
and about
Opposition
what can be
Business.
at the beginning of the question and how much has to be about the substance
The Manager
of the
of
question.
Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Treasurer is in order. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has had some big ideas. I tell you what one big idea was. A national driver's licence, Mr Speaker. That was going to revolutionise transport and travel across Australia. You could go from Melbourne to Sydney with the same licence. Phase 2 of the program, maybe you could get to Brisbane as well, Mr Speaker. Now, the Leader of the Opposition has self-described himself as an economist by training. So what was his second big idea? A $6 billion cash splash to people who have already had the jab. Now, the Shadow Finance Minister said the time has passed for that, but the policy is still on Labor's website. Now, Mr Speaker, the self-described economist by training had to go back to the textbooks. He had to come up with his third big idea. And he went, oh no. Stop the clock.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker. The question did not go to—
Well, the point of order that was raised by the Manager of Opposition Business—
It wasn't relevant.
Was—
What's about relevance?
All right, OK.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, the question, as I heard it, didn't go to my economics degree or
no, but it did go to
alternative
policies.
Well, he's not talking about policies. He's not talking about my policies.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Treasurer has the call.
Speaker, we are going to alternative policies, looking for that third big idea.
Where's my teddy bear?
Point of order. On the point of order.
I was just asking what your ruling was on the last point of order.
The Treasurer
ruling wasn't
is
made.
the
Please,
Treasurer,
can I make the point of order?
I'm sorry.
I was just asking if I can complete the point of order.
The Treasurer, the Leader of the Opposition, raised a point of order on relevance.
Yes.
The Treasurer is being relevant. The
By
Treasurer
talking about policies that don't exist.
The Treasurer has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, the third big idea, the third alternative policy, we found it. The Leader of the Opposition did a doorstop where he's talking about his electric vehicle policy, and he said, I quote, "Labor will make electric vehicles cheaper by removing the excise." Mr Speaker, there's only one technical problem with that. There is no fuel excise on electric vehicles. That's the point. They don't use fuel. They go by electricity, Mr Speaker. So concerned by the Leader of the Opposition's credentials on taxes, he wants to abolish a tax that doesn't even exist. Mr Speaker, we have a Leader of the Opposition. We have a Leader of the Opposition who's not trained as an economist. We have a Leader of the Opposition who's on training wheels.
Order. The member for Rankin has the call.
No wonder you
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the current Treasurer name any other Treasurer in the last 100 years that has a worse record than him on waste, rorts, debt, deficits, annual growth and real wages?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll tell you what I'm very proud of. I'll tell you what I'm very proud of. After the first recession in nearly 30 years, unemployment today is lower than it was under Labor, Mr Speaker. Lower than it was under Labor. The fact that today we have trade apprentices in the highest number on record. The fact today that... Oh, no.
On the point of order.
Speaker, the point of order is relevance. The question was, has there been a bigger disaster of a Treasurer than him? And the answer is no.
Well, the member for Rankin may not like the answer, but it was asked in such a way that you asked for whether there was a worse record on waste. So the Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, today we've seen first home buyers in the market.
The member for Wills is warned.
Today we've seen first home buyers in the market in the highest numbers in more than a decade, Mr Speaker. Today we've seen, as a result of programs like JobKeeper, more than 700,000 jobs saved. Today we have more women in the Australian workforce than under Labor, Mr Speaker. Today the gender pay gap is narrower than it was under Labor, Mr Speaker. In the last 3 months, we have seen more than $10 billion in tax relief to more than 11 million Australians. As a result of policies supported by those on this side of the House, an Australian who's on $60,000 a year is $6,480 better off, Mr Speaker. $6,480 better off. And a result of the business investment incentives, the biggest on record that we put in recent budgets, Mr Speaker, we have seen investment in machinery and equipment more than 20% higher. That's the strongest growth in machinery and equipment investment in more than 20 years, Mr Speaker. Small businesses. We have seen the company tax rate for small businesses come down to 25%, the lowest in 50 years. We have seen small and medium-sized businesses create 600,000 jobs between April last year and September this year. That's 1,300 jobs a day, Mr Speaker, of policies under this side of the House. Now, I tell you what, Mr Speaker, I tell you one treasurer who didn't do as well as that, and that was the former member for Lilly, Wayne Swan, Mr Speaker, because the member for Rankin learnt at his footsteps, Mr Speaker, and the member for Lilly said after the train wreck of the last election, $387 billion of higher taxes, that the Labor Party should not resile from those tax hikes, Mr Speaker. And you know who was the architect of those higher taxes? The member for Rankin. Sneaky, Mr Speaker, because when they get another chance on the Treasury benches, they're only going to do one thing. They're going to hit Australians with higher taxes.
Order. The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is also to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government is assisting Australian families and businesses with their costs by cutting taxes and strengthening our economy's ability to rebound from the impact of COVID-19? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question. I acknowledge his distinguished contribution to our country in uniform and his support for mental health initiatives and his support for veterans across his community, the largest barracks in Australia, Mr Speaker, at Townsville. And, Mr Speaker, he understands the importance of cutting taxes and business investment incentives across his electorate and across the country, because Woolloomooloo Group, which is a mobile crane group in his electorate, have benefited from those investment incentives to purchase 10 additional mobile cranes, Mr Speaker. It's a steel fabrication business, and it's used those tax investment incentives to go and grow the business and, of course, to continue to employ Australians. Now, we as a country have responded to the greatest economic shock since the Great Depression, with programs like JobKeeper and the cash flow boost, $750 payments to pensioners, to carers, to veterans and others on income support, as well as continuing to provide tax relief. Tax relief that has seen more than $10 billion in the last 3 months go to more than 11 million Australians. Business investment incentives have seen machinery and equipment growth up at the highest level in more than 2 decades, and of course cutting company tax rates to the lowest level in 50 years. And Australia has been able to maintain its AAA credit rating. Through this crisis, Australia is one of only 9 countries in the world to have a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies. Now, our policies about driving the creation of more jobs and lowering taxes so Australians could keep more of what they earn. But the alternative policies to be put at the next election are the higher taxes proposed by those opposite. How do we know? Because at the last election they took $387 billion of higher taxes. Do you remember that? The member for Rankin saying he was proud and pleased of the retirees and the housing tax. Do you remember the member for McMahon saying to the Australian people, if you don't like our higher taxes, don't vote for it? Well, they took him literally. Do you remember the member for Sydney saying Labor's policies, tax policies, were well designed and the Australian people will be relaxed about it when they understand the detail? And do you remember the member for Maribyrnong attacking retirees from what he called hitting golf balls effectively from the back of their yachts? And then, of course, the Leader of the Opposition, when he was asked about—
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
I'm just— sorry, on direct relevance. He's not talking about policies. He's just giving random comments and his own character assessment up and down the aisle. This doesn't go to policy. Even on the broadest definition of what was asked, I don't see how it's relevant.
The Treasurer will return to the dispatch box and remain relevant to the question, please.
Well, Mr Speaker, I tell you one alternative policy that's been worked up by the member for Rankin. That's a $27 billion higher tax on family businesses. And it was revealed on the front page of The Australian that he had taken that policy to the shadow cabinet. There is on one side of the House that is committed to lower taxes. That's the coalition. Only the Labor Party is committed to higher taxes.
The Leader of the Opposition, I would appreciate it if the Leader of the Opposition went to the dispatch box after after I've given you the call, or after the time is up. Thank you.
Thanks,
Leader of the
Mr.
Opposition
Speaker.
has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said electric vehicles won't tow your trailer, won't tow your boat, and will end the weekend. But now he says he didn't ridicule the technology. Does he think Australians don't notice when he says something on television and later pretends it never happened? Why does this Prime Minister keep making things up?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want Australians to have choice. I want Australians to have a choice about what sort of car they want to drive, Mr Speaker. I want them to have a choice about whether they use gas or electricity, Mr Speaker. I want them to have a choice about whether they want to work in a heavy industry in a regional area or have that job taken away from them, Mr Speaker, which is what would happen under the policies of the Labor and the Greens, Mr Speaker. That's what would happen to those jobs. I want Australians to have those choices. I want Australians to be able to plan for their future with confidence, Mr Speaker. And I want the big companies that make these electric vehicles to get their prices down without the Australian people have to pump subsidies into them, Mr Speaker. So if they wish to buy them, they can do so. But if the Labor Party wants to send money over to Europe, Mr Speaker, to big manufacturing companies to subsidise, Mr Speaker, now those opposites saying where and when. So this is the problem with the Labor Party. We don't know what their policies are. We don't always know what their policies are, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker, on relevance. This went to the Prime Minister saying that he didn't ridicule the technology on electric vehicles. It didn't go to some fantasy policy that he's just making up. We want things to be made here. It's your mob that sent the car industry offshore.
Leader of the Opposition, in raising a point of order is not an opportunity to raise another argument. The Prime Minister has the call, and I'd ask the Prime Minister to remain relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'm speaking about electric vehicles, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition didn't know what one was. He didn't know a hydrogen-powered electric vehicle was an electric vehicle, and he was the Minister for Transport for 6 years, Mr Speaker. That was actually his job, and he didn't know what it was, Mr Speaker. Heaven knows what he'd do on national security and the economy. The guy's never put a budget together. He spent 6 weeks sitting in the National Security Minister. I apologise, Mr Speaker. I'll return to the topic. And our policy when it comes to those vehicles, Mr Speaker, is we want to ensure that those technology costs come down so they can be affordable to Australians who wish to buy them. We don't want, Mr Speaker, to pay out subsidies to large companies overseas to make them cheaper, Mr Speaker. If people want to buy them, then we want the car companies to make sure they're more affordable and they bring down the costs on their technology because there is a large market for it. But what we won't do, I can tell you this, what we won't do, Mr Speaker, is put up the price of the cars they're now buying and that they wish to buy, Mr Speaker, to try and force their choice to another choice, Mr Speaker. It's the Labor Party who loves to tell you what to do. They love to make your choices for you.
Has the Prime Minister finished his question? Well, the Prime Minister wasn't asked for. The Manager of Opposition Business can return to his seat. The Prime Minister wasn't asked in relation to alternative policies. The Prime Minister has the call.
I was not asked about alternative policies, Mr Speaker, because I couldn't actually speak of the alternative policies. I wasn't asked about alternative policies, Mr Speaker. All I can go in terms of alternative policies from the opposition is what they did at the last election, Mr Speaker, because that's the only thing we know. And there's only one thing worse than Labor telling you what they're going to do is when they're so sneaky not to tell you.
Order. The member for Moreton is warned, by the way. The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Congratulations on your election. I've had cause overnight to reflect on some of the practical jokes I played on you in your first term and wishing perhaps I shouldn't have. But in any event, my question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please advise the House on how the Morrison government is supporting the health security of all Australians by investing in vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 while continuing to invest in medicines, including those that assist Australians with a diagnosis of prostate cancer?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and congratulations. To the member for Barker, I particularly want to acknowledge his work in supporting the mental health of people in rural Australia during the course of the pandemic. And one of our great national health security achievements has been to see that in 2020, when many expected tragedy on a terrible scale, the rate of suicide in Australia went down. There's more to do, but it's one of our great achievements together as a chamber, as a parliament, as a government, as a nation. Another great thing is that we now have one of the lowest rates of loss of life to COVID in the world, at the same time having one of the highest rates of vaccination and the strongest economic recoveries in the world. In particular, we have now, through this vaccination program, passed the vaccination averages for first doses of the EU, the G7, the OECD, the United States, Israel, the United Kingdom, Germany and now France. All of these things are saving lives and protecting lives at a time when there have been 600,000 cases worldwide in one day, 7,000 lives lost in one day worldwide. So the vaccination rate of 91.8% for first dose and 85.8% for second dose is protecting Australians. But at the same time, we're also investing in treatments. Ronapreve, to make sure, along with Sotrovimab, that we have hospital infusions that are already protecting and treating Australians and bringing down the loss of life, even for those that are in hospital at this point in time. Critical treatments, Molnupiravir, where we've acquired 300,000 units, the Pfizer protease inhibitor with 500,000 units. All of these things are saving lives and protecting lives now and in the future as those new treatments are approved and therefore made available. At the same time, what we've also been doing is continuing our work in the listing of new medicines under the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. This program, which has been a staple of Australia's health condition with one issue in 2011, is fundamental to the protection of Australians. On the 1st of November, at the start of November, we were able to list a new medicine for prostate cancer, Nubeqa. Nubeqa is going to help 1,000 Australian men save $40,000 a year, but much more importantly than the money saved, give them access to a life-changing, life-improving and, in some cases, life-saving treatment. Vaccines, COVID treatments, treatments for prostate cancer, treatments for numerous conditions. These are the things that are saving lives.
Order. The member for Spence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said that batteries to store renewable energy are as useful as the big banana and the big prawn. Then he said that that was a complete misrepresentation. Given the Prime Minister is on tape calling the big battery in South Australia as useful as a big banana and a big prawn, why is he pretending that he didn't?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think if I remember correctly, the size of the battery, I think I said would actually charge. That would actually charge the
Prime
televisions.
The Prime Minister was
Adelaide.
just. The microphone's not on, Prime Minister. Sorry. If it is, I can't hear it. I'm going to just start again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The comments I was making on that day, I recall them. I was down in Adelaide, and I was talking, Mr Speaker, how the battery technology at that time, that large battery, Mr Speaker, that large battery would have been able to charge all the television sets in Adelaide for no more and wouldn't get you through one episode of Australia's Ninja Warrior. And the point I was making, Mr Speaker, was what we need in this country is long-duration storage, Mr Speaker, which is why we were investing in projects like Snowy Hydro 2.0. Now, Mr Speaker, of course we should invest in battery technology. It's part of our low emissions technology plan to get us to net zero by 2050, Mr Speaker. But those opposite are kidding themselves if they think that is going to keep the aluminium smelters at Portland or at Tomago, Mr Speaker, firing up. I tell you what's going to help those.
What's going to help those in particular, Mr Speaker, is the work that we've invested through Snowy Hydro to ensure there's a gas-fired power plant at Kurri. And you know who's opposed to that in the Hunter? The Labor Party, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party and the Greens working together to work against Australians having affordable, reliable power. They don't want to see the gas. They want to turn the gas off on Australian industry, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, on direct relevance, there's nothing asked about alternative policies. I don't see why we have to rise each time. The Prime Minister knows that this is not directly relevant to the question, and he does it to defy every single time.
Well, the question was very open-ended insofar as it talked about the Prime Minister's position in relation to batteries and battery power. Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And there is no reference to opposition policy. And that's what he's wanting to talk about. No reference to it at all.
Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will be relevant to the question, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was asked about my comments on that day. And I was asked, and I'm providing the context of the comments on that day. And the context of those comments on that day was battery storage was not at a scale, and frankly is still not at a scale, that competes with long-duration storage like projects like Snowy 2.0. And those sorts of battery projects are not at a level yet, but we must invest in them so we can rely on them for the heavy industry that this country needs. That is what our policy is based on. We have a policy which is about reducing emissions, which is about technology, not taxes. It's about choices, not mandates, Mr Speaker. It's about ensuring we're investing in a portfolio of technologies which mean we can get those costs down to meet those important targets. It's about ensuring that we have reliable and affordable power, and that's why we are investing in gas. That's why we're keeping the gas on, Mr Speaker. And those opposite, they really don't like this policy. They've been attacking our policies, Mr Speaker. They've been seeking to mock the policy. So if you don't like technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker, it means you need taxes, Mr Speaker. That's what it means, taxes, taxes,
has expired, and I give the call to the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you and congratulations, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is working with Australia's strategic partners to secure a free and prosperous Indo-Pacific, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for Moncrieff for her question and recognise the fact that she is a very strong supporter of defence industry in her electorate. And only a few days ago it was announced that aerospace in her electorate on the Gold Coast will provide to the US Defence Force 300 helicopter and fighter jet flight simulators. This will be a significant boost to the Gold Coast, local jobs and a big multiplier in the Gold Coast economy, Mr Speaker. And this government, of course, is investing at a record level when it comes to defence, because we mean what we say when we say that we're going to have the backs of our Australian Defence Force personnel, that we're going to support them with the equipment and the kit that they need, and that we're going to invest, Mr Speaker, to keep this country safe.
Member for Gellibrand is warned.
And, Mr Speaker, we live in a very uncertain time in the Indo-Pacific. It's recognised by countries in our region, it's recognised by the United States, recognised by Europeans, including NATO, and many others have had comment on that, Mr Speaker. The fact is that now for our country is not, Mr Speaker, for a time of weakness but for a time of strength. And when we look at what the Labor Party presided over when they were in government, they weakened the Australian Defence Force today, Mr Speaker, and we are recovering from it. I say that, Mr Speaker, because the fact is that the Labor Party cut funding from defence. They cut it to a level which was equivalent to 1.56% of GDP, the lowest level since 1938. Now, Mr Speaker, if you want to see an example of weakness when it comes to national security, find yourself a government that cuts defence spending on the cusp of an uncertain period in our region. And this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, was a central figure in the Rudd and Gillard governments. He was there for every decision that was made by Prime Minister Rudd and Prime Minister Gillard, not just in relation to cutting defence spending and taking money away from the soldiers of the Australian Defence Force. He was there when they made decisions. In fact, he was a chief advocate, Mr Speaker, of policy which resulted in this country losing control of our borders. Now, Mr Speaker, this Leader of the Opposition, the more he is known to the Australian people, the more that they know he is a weak leader, Mr Speaker. Now, if they want to ask a question, I'm happy to take a question, but I've been in this portfolio, Mr Speaker, for 239 days, and the opposition defence spokesman hasn't asked one question. Bring it on. Bring it on.
Order. Order. The member for Eden-Monaro has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister say he would deliver higher real wages, when in fact real wages have fallen $700 over the past year alone?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I note I get a question from the Labor Party after real wages was falling in their last year in office, Mr Speaker, and unemployment was rising. Now, the reality is we saw, Mr Speaker, we have seen private sector's wages up 2.4%. We have seen nominal wages up 2.2%, Mr Speaker, and we have seen high inflation, higher than was first forecast during this year. But at the same time, we saw last year real wages up by 2.1%, because we saw the largest fall in inflation since the 1960s. So, Mr Speaker, the reality is the best way to get higher wages for the Australian people is to drive a tighter labour market, is to create jobs and see more competition for labour. And that is what our policies are designed to do. Our policies are designed to create more jobs, as we have done since this pandemic has hit. Our policies have been focused on getting more and more people into work. When we came to government, unemployment was 5.7%. Today it's 5.2%, and the Reserve Bank of Australia is forecasting that the unemployment rate will have a 4 in it and be sustainably in the 4s, Mr Speaker, for the first time since the 1970s. At the same time of driving more jobs and the creation of more jobs, we're also cutting taxes. And by cutting taxes, we're putting more money into people's pockets, boosting their disposable income and their ability to spend on the things that they need.
The member for Barara has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is ensuring our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to counter the threat of terrorism and keep all Australians safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for his question, and I thank him for the work that he has done on the very important Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Now, on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we understand that national security is absolutely essential to our plan to grow the Australian economy, particularly following COVID-19. You actually can't have one without the other. So even as we've been going through the process of tackling and dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have never, ever lost sight of the fact that there are many challenges that we are facing in terms of our national security, and we understand very clearly that the world around us is changing very dramatically, and we as a government have always been alive to those challenges. And sadly, the threat of terrorism and violent extremism is very, very real. Our national terrorism threat level has remained at probable since September 2014, and in that time 145 people have been charged as a result of 72 counter-terrorism-related operations around Australia. And in fact, it was just last month that 3 men were before the New South Wales courts and were convicted of separate terrorism offences. So it's absolutely a reminder that the threat has not gone away. So this morning, Mr Speaker, I announced the government's intention to list in its entirety Hezbollah, as well as the base, as a terrorist organisation under the Criminal Code. Hezbollah's external security organisation has been a listed terrorist organisation since 2003. The group continues to threaten terrorist attacks and provide support to terrorist organisations, so it's fitting that we extend the listing to the entirety of Hezbollah. The base is a violent, racist, neo-Nazi group known by security agencies to be planning and preparing terrorist attacks. So, Mr Speaker, the violence and the views of these extremist groups are a stain on Australia's rich cultural fabric. There is no place in Australia for their hateful ideologies, and our government has invested over $69 million in funding to counter violent extremism since 2013. The Morrison government will always focus on national security and protecting the Australian way of life from those who would seek to do us harm. Not only is it the first duty of government, it's also the foundation of securing our economic recovery.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister admit that real Australian workers are being paid less than their colleagues for doing the same job simply because they work for a labour hire firm? Does he agree this is a real problem which is causing inequality and depressing wages? Or does he agree with his minister and the statement he made yesterday that it is a made-up issue?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Australians working right across the country are working under the rules and the laws put together under the Fair Work Act, Mr Speaker. And you know who put those laws and rules together, Mr Speaker? The Labor Party. The Labor Party put those rules and laws together, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, when they wrote those laws, the number of people who were employed, Mr Speaker, through labour hire was the same as it is now. It was exactly the same, Mr Speaker. Exactly the same. There has been no real change when it comes to those issues over the course of that time. And, Mr Speaker, there are many different ways people are now being employed in the Australian economy since there used to be. And it's important, Mr Speaker, that we have the dynamism in our economy to give people those many different options and choices about how they wish to engage in the Australian economy. And we want to ensure that they have those opportunities, but they need to ensure they do it in accordance with the rules of law of this country. And those rules of law, Mr Speaker, particularly when it came to these issues, were written by those opposite. It was written by those opposite, Mr Speaker, and so we will continue to ensure that we enforce that rule of law when it comes to these conditions, Mr Speaker, and we want to see businesses. We want to see businesses, Mr Speaker, succeed. Businesses succeeding in this country, small and medium-sized enterprises who have gone through, particularly family businesses, through one of the hardest times they have ever had to go through, Mr Speaker, since the Second World War and certainly since the Great Depression economically. They're the ones who workers rely on for their wages, Mr Speaker. And if you've got more small businesses doing better, if you've got their taxes down, if you're getting government out of their face so they can go ahead and employ more people, Mr Speaker. And we took bills into this parliament to try and improve the opportunities, Mr Speaker. We took a bill to this parliament in the course of this term. We sat down between employers and employees. We sought to bring everybody together, and we took the product of that to this place, and the Labor Party voted against it, Mr Speaker. They voted against it because they wanted to use this issue as a political issue. They're all about the politics. They're not about the solution, Mr Speaker. All insults and no ideas.
The member for Riverina has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the minister please outline how the Morrison-Joyce government's sustained investment in biosecurity services and new technologies ensures Australia has one of the most effective biosecurity systems in the world, and how this allows our farmers, the best in the world, to maintain production levels and attain premiums for their product in international markets?
The Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia has the
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Riverina for his question, because he knows better than anyone the importance of strong biosecurity systems and penalties, not just in protecting agricultural production, which for the first time in our nation's history will hit over $70 billion this year, but also in protecting the over 330,000 Australians that are employed in agriculture. And as the threats are starting to evolve, as they're sweeping across the globe, across Asia and now into Southeast Asia, literally they are blowing in. But we are making sure that our borders are strong, not just through technology, but also through more boots on the ground, more paws on the ground, but also penalising those that want to flout our biosecurity laws. I'm proud to say that over the last 2 budgets, since October last year, over $1 billion has been pumped into biosecurity to make sure we are protecting them. And I'm saying today that we're proud to announce 96 new biosecurity officers that will go to ports and airports in major capital cities around the country as we reopen from COVID-19 to ensure that we have that protection. We're also putting more dogs, more scientists to make sure that we can identify these pests, these risks to Australian agriculture immediately, so that we can have a detailed response as quick as we possibly can. But the technology piece is so important as well. We, for the first time, will have 3D X-ray scanners in all of our Australia Post facilities. The 144 million parcels that go through Australia Post every year will now go through a 3D X-ray scanner with artificial intelligence that will be able to identify organic matter, plant matter, so that we can intercept those risks to Australia straight away. I'm proud to say we also have a partnership with New Zealand, a world first. For anyone that leaves New Zealand, we will now use that technology on people's bags. We will know what's in their bag before it gets to Australia, and we will match that with their declaration cards to ensure that they are being honest and they're declaring the threats that may be posed to Australian agriculture. And if we're able to prove this up, this is technology that can be adopted around the world for other ports that will send passengers into Australia. This is an important step in building the capacity and capability of our biosecurity systems. We're saying to those that want to import into this country, they also have a role to play. We're trying to be more efficient at our ports. We'll go from around 5 million containers a year to over 8.5 million by the end of the decade. But we're saying to them with that, and in terms of giving them some more opportunity to self-assess, that comes responsibility. If you flout the laws as an importer, those penalties have been increased from just over $400,000 to over $1 million. And if it's serious, you'll not only pay that, you'll be at emergency's pleasure for up to 10 years. We're also saying to those that come into this country, if they do not declare that self-declaration in a proper manner, you will pay a penalty from $444 now up to $2,664. And I'm proud to say that we have cancelled 14 visas of those that have gone and tried to cut corners. We do not apologise, and they are not welcome back for another 3 years.
The honourable minister's time has expired. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the speech prior to question time from the member for Dawson, in which he criticised actions by state governments to secure the health of Australians, referred to it as police states complete with medical apartheid, compared them with Stalin, Mao, Hitler and Pol Pot, and most concerning at the end of his speech said the solution is the rediscovery of human dignity and, along with, and I don't say this lightly, civil disobedience. Will the Prime Minister unequivocally and without reservation condemn this call for civil disobedience from his government member for Dawson?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the son of a police officer, I believe that everyone should obey the law, Mr Speaker. Every single person should obey the law, and no one should encourage anyone to disobey the law. No one, Mr Speaker. I don't care if they're in this House or anywhere else, and I indeed, Mr Speaker, would condemn any encouragement whatsoever by any person in any place, Mr Speaker, regarding acts of civil disobedience. That is not something I would encourage. That's not something I would participate in, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, I don't think I can be any clearer than that. Mr Speaker, I have been very clear in my denunciation of violence and threats and intimidation, and I don't care, Mr Speaker, whether that has occurred most recently or where it happened at the Shrine of Remembrance, Mr Speaker, or indeed when people and Labor unions tried to crash through the doors of this building many years ago, Mr Speaker. Every single time I have seen this, I find it appalling. I find it appalling, Mr Speaker, and I don't think it is an issue that those opposite seek to play politics with.
The member, order. The member for Chisholm has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is boosting the capacity of frontline domestic violence services and ensuring the accountability under the next national plan to reduce violence against women and their children?
The Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women, has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Chisholm for her question and commend her on the leadership she shows in her electorate for women and girls. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is absolutely focused on making Australia a place that is free from violence against women and their children. Across Australia, violence against women is estimated to cost $21.7 billion a year. But it's the social and emotional cost that is immeasurable, as so many live every day from the fallout of this invisible pandemic, especially the often silent victims, the children. We demonstrated our commitment to ending family and domestic violence in the 21-22 budget, where we made the largest ever commitment to women's safety with our $1.1 billion package. This historic package includes key measures that contribute to our net zero target. Importantly, it provided a down payment on the next national plan to not only reduce but to end violence against women and their children, because we should always remember that violence against women is not inevitable, it's entirely preventable. And we all have a role to play, which is why we partnered with the states and through our $260 million National Partnership Agreement on Family, Domestic and Sexual Violence, which was the single biggest payment from the Commonwealth to states and territories, as well as the $130 million we were able to provide to ensure that frontline workers continued to support women through the pandemic. Now, that investment went to more than 450 support and crisis organisations, so they could employ hundreds more staff and deliver those important services to women across the country. And we know the next national plan needs to be more than ambitious words. It's why we're backing it with our funding, but it's why we're investing $22.4 million over 5 years to establish a new Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission. The Commission will oversee the implementation of the next national plan. It will support the government developing and fostering relationships, ensuring greater cooperation and transparency, providing national leadership and accountability, and make sure the next national plan delivers real and tangible actions. Mr Speaker, with the record funding we've provided, with strong organisations such as this new commission, it will allow us to get closer to the outcomes that we all seek, to stop it at the start, to call it out, to know that help is here on 1800-RESPECT, to shine a light so that we leave no one behind.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Briefly, Mr Speaker, on indulgence, the scourge of domestic and family violence is something that we all, not just governments but community organisations and indeed our entire society, has to take greater action in.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer in response to my question about the comments in this parliament from the member for Dawson, in which he refused to mention the member for Dawson. I invite him to directly condemn the member for Dawson for the very specific comments that he has made, saying that part of the solution is, to quote him, I don't say this lightly, civil disobedience.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I restate, Mr Speaker, exactly what I have said in my answer to the previous question. And, Mr Speaker, I note this, though. This is a quote from Sally McManus, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The members on both sides, order. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to direct relevance. This was a very specific question about a member of this Prime Minister's government and statements that were made in this
Parliament. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is entitled to some preamble, but it was a very direct question, and I'm going to ask the Prime Minister to respond to the question, please.
And so I complete the quote that I was going to refer to because it's relevant, Mr Speaker. It is relevant.
No, the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition the Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will directly respond to the question. It's not appropriate 12 seconds in or 15 seconds into a question to make a quote of Sally McManus. I ask the Prime Minister to respond to the question directly, please.
I do condemn those statements. And, Mr Speaker, I also condemn statements like this. Mr Speaker, they're very touchy on this, aren't you? You don't want me to read it out, do you?
The Manager of Opposition Business. Order. Order. Is the Manager of Opposition Business want to take me to it?
Yeah, Mr Speaker, I raise a point of order under Standing Order 91C, where a member's conduct shall be considered disorderly if the member has C, persistently and wilfully refused to conform to a standing order, which is exactly what the Prime Minister is now doing in defiance of your ruling.
The Prime Minister has the call. I'd ask the Prime Minister again to respond to the question.
Mr Speaker,
and be directly relevant
Mr
to the question.
Speaker, on the point of order, I have responded directly to the member's question in denunciating those statements. I've been very clear about that, Mr Speaker. I've been very clear about that. Mr Speaker, I believe in the rule of law when the law is fair and the law is right.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. I'll go to the next question. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The next question is an independent question. Member for Longman has the call.
And just to state that I'm a member of the coalition, not an independent.
Member for Longman has the call.
Let him, sir. Mr Speaker, let him go. Let him go.
The member for Kennedy has the call.
Mr Speaker, I would address my question to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Sally McManus has been a great union leader in this country. Would you quote her in this House, please?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, and I thank the member for Kennedy for his question. Mr Speaker, this is what the Leader of the Trade Union Movement said. I believe in the rule of law when the law is fair and the law is right. But when it's unjust, I don't think there's a problem with breaking it, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, we should respect the rule of law. We should always respect the rule of law, Mr Speaker.
Order.
We shouldn't encourage people to break the law, Mr Speaker. It shouldn't be optional, Mr Speaker, for trade union leaders and militant union thugs, Mr Speaker, who might want to come onto sites. It's not okay for Mr Speaker for members to encourage those to be wilfully not obeying the law by going on, Mr Speaker, and preventing people from accessing their place of work, which those opposite Mr Speaker know all about. know all about, Mr Speaker. There's no wonder, Mr Speaker, why those opposite did not want me to read out that quote. There is no wonder why they didn't, because it betrays their hypocrisy. It betrays their hypocrisy, Mr Speaker, that it's all right for union thugs to come and try and knock this building down, Mr Speaker. It's all right for that. We'll support them then, Mr Speaker. We'll support them when they're out working away with John Setka and outlawed motorcycle gangs, Mr Speaker. And it's OK, Mr Speaker, when they commit these crimes, they'll let them stay in this country, which is what happened under the Labor Party. But when we, Mr Speaker, when we're in government, Mr Speaker, and we want to send those thugs out of this country, and we want to introduce laws that strengthen our protections to enable us to kick those thugs out of this country, guess who votes against us? The Labor Party, Mr Speaker. That's not the sort of weakness this country needs, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition was part of a Labor Party which let outlawed motorcycle gang thugs and the union leaders who worked with them, Mr Speaker, to get away scot-free. That's not how you run a country if you're a strong leader, Mr Speaker. This Leader of the Opposition is a weak reed, Mr Speaker. He is a weak reed. He is not someone, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, there was no doubt the first part of the answer was in order, and there's no doubt that this part is completely irrelevant to the question.
I expel him.
Has the Prime Minister completed his answer?
No.
Just before the Prime Minister continues,
to support that bill, which the Minister
the Prime Minister, the microphone's not on. I haven't given you the call. The microphone's not on. The Prime Minister will. The question that was asked by the member for Kennedy was extraordinarily broad in relation to. So I'll give the call to the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister should return to the general thrust of the question.
Mr Speaker, I can only go back to what the Leader of the trade union movement said, Mr Speaker, when she said she didn't have a problem with people breaking the law. Mr Speaker. Now, I understand the Labor Party has sympathy with that. I'm wondering whether the Leader of the Opposition will be going out, and many of his mates out there have gone to prison, Mr Speaker, that he backed into their roles in the New South Wales Parliament, or whether they're going down to Eddie Obeid's ski lodge this winter, Mr Speaker.
Order. The Prime Minister has completed his question. The member for Longman has the call.
That wasn't my intention, Mr Speaker, but it kind of worked out beautifully, didn't it? My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. Will the Minister update the House on the strong leadership the Morrison government is demonstrating to keep Australian children safe online?
The Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts.
Well, I do thank the member for Longman, who has a very strong commitment to the rule of law, online and offline, Mr Speaker. In the physical town square, people have a right to be protected by the rule of law, and in the digital town square, people have a right to be protected by the rule of law, and that is a principle that our government has been putting into practice consistently since we came to government in 2013. We established the Children's E-Safety Commissioner. We established a legislative scheme to deal with the serious cyberbullying of children. We expanded that with a scheme to deal with the removal of unauthorised intimate images, something which is absolutely devastating for victims and overwhelmingly affects women and girls. We responded to the appalling Christchurch mosque attack, where more than 50 people were murdered, and that was live-streamed on social media an extraordinary demonstration of irresponsibility by the platforms, with a scheme to require the removal of abhorrent violent material. There have been some 10,000 complaints since 2015 about child sexual abuse material, 73% of that removed within 6 days, and I acknowledge the work of the Minister for Home Affairs. We work very closely together on these issues. And of course we came to government, we returned to government in 2019 with a commitment to establish a new Online Safety Act. We've consulted, we've legislated, that's now on the statute books. That will take effect from January next year, and that will reduce, for example, the time in which social media platforms are required to respond to a takedown notice from the E-Safety Commissioner to 24 hours. We've expanded the scope of the coverage of the regime dealing with cyberbullying against children, so it now goes beyond social media platforms and will include, for example, chat rooms for games. And we've increased the maximum criminal penalties for those using a carriage service to menace, harass or offend from 3 years to 5 years. We've provided extra funding to the E-Safety Commissioner, $15 million for extra investigators to support the victims of online abuse. There's record funding, Mr Speaker, $125 million over 4 years for e-safety. We're developing the basic online safety expectations, which will be issued in final form early next year, under which a clear statement will be made to the platforms of what we expect of them on behalf of the Australian community, including that they are expected to protect Australian children from online harms. We've given the E-Safety Commissioner new powers to report to require the tech companies to report on how they are responding to these harms. Mr Speaker, the principle that children and adults deserve to be safe online as they are offline is one that our government is very strongly committed to. We are taking action to make the internet a safer place for Australian children.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.